what I want to share with you is how I've come to understand one of the key important tenets, I think, of Buddhism, and that is the Four Noble Truths that I'll go over. And again, I'll go over rather quickly. And hopefully, though, it'll feel like, oh, wait, what did I do? Is it? Okay. Oh, there you go. So are folks looking at the PowerPoint, Evan? Yeah, thanks. So, and again, we're talking about suffering and wholeness, and we're going to approach it from the three jewels, which is Buddha nature, our Dharma, our wisdom, and our Sangha. And as we do that, I'm going to invite you to think of this as participation, right? The idea that in addition to the multicultural agreements that East Bay Meditation Center offers, that I also want to just add these, that when I think about the work that I do, it is about how can we continue to be loving, be powerful, and be just. And I'm going to share with you a framework that I share in all my talks a little bit later about how love, power, and justice are interdependent. So I encourage you and invite you into our space tonight with these intact, and just know that that's my intention, as well as to be loving, to be powerful, and to be just. And so to begin, I wanted to note that I believe the Sangha really is about how do we make our space, East Bay Meditation Center in particular, whole. The idea that we are individuals who are members of many different groups of our race and gender and ethnicities and all of that. And so is another person, right? And I love this concept of Ubuntu, of I am because we are. The idea that I am all of these things and you are all of these things, and we are then even all of these things. And at sometimes in the Sangha, in our communities, there's this sense of belonging and sense of othering that can happen, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. What I want to offer is that what we want to do and what we believe we can do, at least at East Bay Meditation Center and many Sanghas, is the idea that we can radically include all of that. We can include where we're different as well as where we're similar. We can include where at times we're aligned and have a sense of belonging, and even at times where we don't feel like we belong, that we've othered each other. And that's where, again, I draw from Savabona in the sense that it's another African concept that I see you, and it's a greeting that I see you, and your response would be, I am here. And that really says that we are willing to acknowledge each other and in some ways move towards having an obligation to each other's well-being. So if I see you, that means you are now in my life. And if you see me, that means I'm now in your life. And that makes it difficult to then stop unseeing that, right? To stop thinking that we're not in each other's life in one way or the other. And that's what I really love about this concept of Savabona. And I actually believe that, so even as I'm not even sure of all your names or what land you're on or your pronouns, as I see you, I have a feeling that tonight I am actually working towards developing and nurturing our belonging to each other. This is my way of demonstrating how I'm obligated to your well-being, my well-being, and our well-being. And others have heard me say before that anytime I enter a space, I'm always actively trying to figure out how to fall in love with people. And now I've gotten pretty good at it in that it doesn't take me much to fall in love with you. And as we continue to have relationships built along the way, it just gets deeper and deeper. At the same time, in Sangha like ours, what I find difficult is the truth of the way we are, right? And the truth in some ways might surprise me in that people are not loving and loyal all the time. There are moments where my brothers and I didn't talk for a year, and we would say we were loving, but we didn't act very loving, right? And then as I get going in my work and career, I always realize too that things do not always go according to plan, especially my plan. And that's tough, especially when I'm working in a Sangha, like community like ours. Why aren't we all doing the things that I think are right for us to do? And come to that, then I come to also realize the truth of our Sangha, that life is not always fair. Some of us have various degrees of suffering, and they're not all the same. as well as others of us have various degrees of joy. And it's not always the same, and it's just not always fair. And from that, then acknowledge that pain is a part of life and that everything changes and it ends. So there's impermanence. So what I've come to know and what I've come to believe in terms of the Dharma, seeking refuge in our Sangha and being able to be open to the truth and wisdom, is that in order for us really to be a part of each other's lives, I think the task is to cultivate acceptance of these conditions. How can we cultivate acceptance that we're not always going to be loyal and loving, that things aren't always going to go according to plan, that life isn't always fair? And then how is the work together, as difficult as it might be, to learn to accept, even embrace these predicaments without even trying to control the outcomes, right? And that for me and here among us in a community of practice, that these are opportunities for our spiritual practice to really see the truth and wisdom that's even coming out of the chaos and the hardships. And that the way, what that cultivates for us then is relationships with each other that are becoming reality-based rather than expectations-based. So I'm not only going to like you if you act the way I want you to act, I'm going to like you based on who you are and how you act. And if we're truly striving for community and Sangha, you will do that with me, and we will do that with each other, and will we do that with others? So when I talked about what I think awakening is, when I talked about the suffering and wholeness, harm and harming, agency and healing, restoration and liberation, I was really naming the Four Noble Truths. The first one being that in life there is suffering. So when the Buddha first came out of his moment of enlightenment, he shared this. And he didn't say, though, that suffering is the only thing, that in life there's wholeness, there is joy. Often what we do, though, is think suffering should not happen. So that the first noble truth is that in life there is suffering and that there are causes for our suffering. Often those causes are the ways that we're trying to grasp or crave the way that we want the world to be, that in a lot of ways is what's contributing to our harm and harming of ourselves and each other. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. At the same time, the third noble truth, if we exercise our agency in a sense of healing, is a belief and the truth that the end of suffering is possible. And that from there, the way it's possible is by following a path. There's a path to end suffering. And in a lot of ways, when we're exploring restoration and liberation, it's along a path. And for me, as I shared, I'm someone who's in 12-step programs. And for me, the 12 steps are very much aligned with the Noble Eightfold Path. And so I'll draw from that to some extent, but in a lot of ways, tonight, I'm also drawing from a series of video talks that Reverend Shet offered called Engaging with the Truth of Suffering, that was done, I think, at the Tricycle Network. So that's that. So let me say then, when we talk about the first noble truth, for me, it's about radical inclusivity, which is one of the key elements of East Bay Meditation Center's strategic plan, really. The idea that we are practicing radical inclusivity for all of who we are, for those things that are wonderful about us and those things that are woeful. And what's beautiful about being in a Sangha and having friends who love me as much as they do, they let me know often that I'm not as wonderful as I might think I am, nor am I as woeful as I think I am. At the same time, there's an acknowledgement that there are things that I might do that are wonderful and woeful. And so when I think about the first noble truth, it's being able to accept that the life is glorious, but life is also wretched. It is both. So how is it that we choose to be able to accept that? And so this is where I'm going to draw from Shawn Ginwright's book, along each of the Four Noble Truths. He talks about 4 pivots in his book, and it's called 4 Pivots, duh. But the first pivot he offers is moving from lens to mirror. So when I think about this in the first noble truth, it's the idea that it's not, the world isn't just how we see it. The world is how it is presented to us. And so it's not just what we might be able to see. I might be looking for the bad, or might be looking for the good. But what the first pivot allows us to do is not just move from just how we might be looking at the world, but lifting up a mirror and to see how the world is reflecting all of what we might be seeing as well as not seeing. And so it's a moment for us to reflect on truth and greater clarity. And so when I think about this, I'm a systems guy, right? So I'm often reflecting on how we can be harder on the structure and softer on the people anyway. And so how are we holding ourselves compassionately accountable for accepting this first noble truth? It's tough to be able to say, yes, hello, suffering. I welcome you into my life, or at least I bow to you. I actually hope that you go, but that also allows me to believe in impermanence. I'm not always going to be suffering, and I'm not always going to be joyful. And sometimes I can be joyful and suffering simultaneously, depending on whatever is going on in my context. The first noble truth, though, allows me to understand that suffering happens. The second noble truth really talks about the cause. And for me, I love this phrase, hurt people hurt people. And part of that is understanding that in the second noble truth, there are causes and there are actually conditions that lead to our suffering. So we may espouse this idea and concept of equality. We may even say, though, we know equality doesn't happen, so we strive for equity, and that the reality is this, right? So part of what I appreciate from Shawn's book is the idea that it really helps us examine what is our own personal contribution to equality, equity, or even this reality. And so what he offers is the second pivot, which is to move from transactional to transformative. The idea that we actually actively strive to belong, to practice acceptance of the world as it is with care and vulnerability, and even strive, though, to be able to be influenced and believe that we have influence on the culture makers, right? On the thinkers, on the practitioners, by noting where it is that we may have attachment or craving. And that attachment or craving often leads to what we call also the three poisons, which are greed, hatred, and delusion. So being able to understand that greed is supported by capitalism, right? Hatred is supported by oppression, and that delusion is really supported in a lot of ways by capitalism. The idea that, we all have equal access to things like the riches, right? So from there, being able to understand that there are causes and conditions and that hurt people, what I appreciate about the third noble truth, that it really for me is about people healing, heal people, that their end of suffering is possible. And so part of what we do is understand that we have to practice compassion in these moments, that we have to heal at a faster rate than the harm being done. And that happens by not just focusing on our problems, but focusing on the possibilities. So moving from problems, because then we're just so solution oriented. But really part of what's missing, and I think the greatest poverty that exists, is that of imagination. It's tough for us to imagine anything better for ourselves, let alone each other. So part of this pivot of problem to possibility is really saying, how do we dream together? How do we dream in such a way of a world that's basking in the joy of justice, as Shawn says? So part of the work is being able to understand that, how do we get creative? And so I even think about the work I'm doing or following around abolitionists, right? Defund the police and all of that. So it's so much that we hear questions about what do we get? We're really actually trying to get rid of police and get rid of prisons. And for me, we're actually trying to develop a world where policing and prisons are obsolete. They're just not needed. And so how can we imagine something like that to get possible and not be locked into the constraints of our current systemic thinking? Which leads then to the fourth noble truth, which is about taking responsibility and holding ourselves accountable. For me, that's the path to that there is a path to end suffering, and that path is the Noble Eightfold Path. And a lot of the way I think about it is what Confucius says is, wherever you go, go with all of your heart. And how I think this relates to the fourth pivot from Shawn's book is it's moving from hustle to flow. The idea that part of what we're often doing is trying to get things done, move at a crazy pace, always operating from a place of urgency. And that sense of urgency is actually what Thomas Merton says is a way that we succumb to the violence, to our own violence, right? Of this endless idea that we can help everybody and do everything. And that in and of itself is doing harm to ourselves. So how do we move from feeling like we have to be hustling all the time to really flowing, being aligned with what justice is, that it requires rest, right? That power and effectiveness are often the results of finding our flow toward justice. So being justice oriented doesn't need to be that hard. And so when I think about all of this together, I think about Adrienne Maree Brown as what we're doing in my mind is developing ourselves as spiritual activists. That transformative justice is relational and it happens at the scale of community. So we can't do this community building and activism on our own. That's why I started first talking about Sangha, then talking about Dharma, and then talking about Buddha nature, right? We need to learn how to practice love such that care for ourselves and others is understood as political resistance and cultivating resilience. Your no makes the way for your yes. Boundaries create the container within which your yes is authentic. Being able to say no makes yes a choice. Again, Adrienne Maree Brown. So in a lot of ways, part of our work is to focus on what it means to set clear boundaries. We can't do everything, and we actually have to be mindful and concentrated, right? And so if I may be so bold, I think what I'm suggesting is moving ourselves toward collectivizing our care and our healing. And again, another quote from Adrienne Maree Brown out of her book, Pleasure Activism. She said, I suspect that to really transform our society, we will need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have. And my mind is, why can't we? Why isn't justice and fairness and collective care something that just really tickles us, right? That brings us joy, that is something that we're constantly trying to figure out how to make happen. And I think self-care may be important, but it often leads to a greater sense of individualism. So that's why I'm really talking about collectivizing our care. And so that's the other book that I've read, which I'm really drawing from, again, is Mariame Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us, where her father in the book says, everything worthwhile is done with others. So if it's worthwhile and you're doing it by yourself, that begs the question, who is it really benefiting? So collectivizing our care and thinking more about how we can help each other is really what we're talking about, I believe. So for example, how can we collectivize the care of children so that more people can feel like they can actually have their kids live in this world? I've learned and I'm learning a lot about nothing about us without us, as well as all of us or none of us, and my activism, especially engaging here in our Sangha, right? And how do we collectivize care so that when any of us are sick and we're not feeling ourselves, we got a crew who are not only just our prayer warriors, but they're actually our action warriors who are thinking through us and thinking through with us, talking about how can I bring this Sangha member food? They may not be able to get out right now. They're struggling with the child. How can I actually give them some respite and take them to the park if they're willing to have me be with them? And how can I be with them while they're even struggling maybe with another person's health in their family? And just say, how can I get your family member food? And do those things that I might be able to do. And so we might be asking ourselves, well, what do we need to do? That's an important question. I think, though, the more important first question is, who do we need to become? And I think the work is, for us, is we are awakening towards becoming pleasure activists and abolitionists, right? And for me, that means we have a vision that we actually have everything we need. You know, we may be in the kind of work that we're always trying to figure out how to raise money, and even East Bay Meditation Center, right? We're in a capital campaign to be able to try buy a building. But in my mind and heart, we do have everything we need. And then at the same time, to keep it real, we do have to have the structural analysis of the world as it is, even though the things that we're holding on to are delusional. These systems of oppression that can really serve as constraints and well as trade-offs. That has us apologizing for how we are. And this is why I love the book, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, where it's really about accepting the way that we are as part of this constant healing, To think that we need to keep changing ourselves, change the way my hair is, change my size, or change the clothing I wear, is in and of itself sometimes doing harm to our own psyche. And that for me, to become pleasure activist and abolitionist, it's actually then a practical organizing strategy. It allows us to be able to practice refusal, where we don't succumb to the violence of trying to do everything and be everything, that we do prioritize care for ourselves and each other, and that we, again, are doing it collectively. So I'm always curious about, why is it so hard? And Adrienne Maree Brown says, this is why it's hard. And we have to understand and reckon with why we swallow our truths. And that is because of capitalism, white supremacy, and this false sense of peace that comes from capitalism, that we can actually, again, buy things to make us feel better. And that really what we're striving for is liberation. And that some of the principles of liberated relationships for her is radical honesty, right? Acknowledging the dynamics between us. Like, there are going to be times that you and I are going to be engaging, and our conflict might be about race, gender, education, height, speech, political perspective, and on and on. So how do we acknowledge that dynamic and still keep growing together? And that this concept of relinquishing Frankenstein, the idea that I am only going to accept you based on the box that I've put you in, or the way I've made you up in my mind. So how do I let go of the way I've kind of built my perception of you, and again, accept you? Let go of the way that I'm making you up, and accept you for the way that you're making yourself up, and doing that together. And so the path for me is often about moving from awareness to acceptance to action. And this is a lot of what I got out of the 12-step programs that I'm in, right? And in a lot of ways for me, that's similar to the Noble Eightfold Path, right? Where awareness is being able to have wisdom from reflection, which is wise understanding and wise intention, or wise attitude. Being able to become aware, how do we understand the Four Noble Truths? How do we understand the world as it is, not just the world as we want it to be? And how do we have the attitude towards acting and choosing the most loving, powerful, and elegant next step? And acceptance is being able to know that I have to practice accepting. I have to put some effort into it by practicing mindfulness and practicing concentrating. Often for me, this is done in meditation. And that action is often, again, the other steps on the path, or paths, things on the path, right? Compassionate conduct. How do I have wise speech, wise action, and have wise livelihood? So when I talk about this and what it means to really awaken the Four Noble Truths, reimagining ourselves and each other, this is the way I often look at it. And again, those of you who've heard me talk before, I share this all the time. We have to take a look at our actions. We have to take a look at our relationships. We have to take a look at the intentions and results of our impact, right? And when we're talking about actions, we're talking about power. So how is power showing up, manifesting? And how is it showing up in our relationships? And in our relationships, are we experiencing love with each other? The ability to willingly extend ourselves to the purpose of nurturing our own and another's spiritual growth, right? Or even accept love as the combination of care, commitment, trust, knowledge, respect, and responsibility, as defined by Bell Hooks in her book, All About Love, right? And then when I think about intention and results, we're talking about how are we achieving justice? How are we achieving liberation? And that's where I pull from the quote of Martin Luther King Jr., where he says that power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I learned Ubuntu from South Africa. When I first heard Bishop Desmond Tutu talk way back, some of you probably weren't even born, during apartheid, right? He came to my college, and when he talked about Ubuntu, I was like so moved. And I actually believe as well that Sobona is a South African, and maybe others as well, but South African is the person I learned it from is South African. How do we grow together while in disagreement? Would that be similar? Yeah. So a lot of the work I get to do, I say get to do, even though I'm not always wanting to do it, is going into communities and holding space towards what some might call transformative justice or even restorative justice spaces and places. And what's particularly unique, I think, for me, is I'm often entering into spaces that are with folks who are progressive and liberal. So it's rarely liberal or conservative. It's like, the sensibility is who's more dope or who's more woke, without saying those kind of terms and phrases. And I would say there's a number of things that the process goes through. And it's about being seen and heard, being seen and seeing, hearing and being heard, acknowledged and being acknowledged. Right? So one, it's being able to accept that other people trigger the karma that I've yet to work out. So when I'm struggling with another person, oftentimes it's because of how I'm holding that person, that I can't accept their particular perspective. And I may not be able to accept their particular perspective because I may not be willing, honestly, to believe that they also have a Buddha nature with which I can connect. Right? So often that's the work. And so that to me, it might sound noble and is really hard, and it is, because there are some folks that I would say, I have said, and I kind of embarrassed to say it, they're the devil, right? And it's tough for me, and I think that again is something that I have to work out, because as my son would say, it takes one to know one, right? So if I can actually say that person's a devil, it might be because this devil is me, is connecting with the devil in that person. And so there's that kind of weird dynamic that plays out, is to what extent am I truly willing to extend the most generous assumption and be willing as well to nurture whatever it might take so that I can extend myself willingly towards our spiritual growth. So that's one, it's the belief. The second is acknowledging that I'm not a saint. So while I might want to keep my windows and door open to anybody and everybody in the community, that's not a good idea. So there may be only some folks that I can let in my life at a time. So I'm not often saying just always get with folks that are like the hardest for you to be with. I don't think that's good practice. It's about developing our muscle to practice being with those who are tough. So I know oftentimes when I go into doing some kind of diversity, equity, inclusion training, for example, I have to desensitize myself before I go into some of these spaces. And what I do is I watch Fox News for a few days so that I keep watching it so I don't immediately react, that I can choose to respond. So if I'm always just reacting, that's coming out of habit, right? That's not coming out of spiritual intention or ritual. So part of what mindfulness allows us to do is practice getting to a space where we can be with the world as it is and me as I am. Sometimes that means I get in touch with those unintended wounds, those things that I've been trying to keep hidden. But it also means, though, I get in touch with it and I can practice developing a relationship with it so that, again, I'm responding more than reacting. The other thing, I guess, the third part, so one is being able to acknowledge that it's not, I can't work with everybody, and it's okay to set boundaries. And the third, though, it is about developing the muscle to be whole, right? It's actually believing that there is non-self. Those folks in all the world, so even during the Trump administration, I know when I was doing metta, I would do metta, send out metta to those, to myself, a dear one, acquaintances, and someone who I find difficult. So for the longest time, it was Trump, it was my dad, it was my brother, it was, maybe I shouldn't have identified specific people. But anyway, it was folks that I just knew I had a hard time that I would need to practice sending loving kindness to. And in full integrity, there are some times that I couldn't, right? And how do I practice gentle compassion with myself and that degree of accountability and not judgment and harshness? So that's the other work. The last thing I guess I'll say, and I've talked about this before, is I think the greatest spiritual and social justice practice that we need to develop is that of accountability. How are we willing to be held accountable for aligning with our divinity? And what I mean by that is, how open am I to let people know what I'm about. So a lot of folks know that my mission is to facilitate, integrate, and cultivate a love-based social justice agenda for community well-being. And so when folks know that, they know that that's how I want to live my life. So they can point to things in my life and ask, how is that aligned with your mission? And how is that not aligned with their mission? So I've developed around me those folks that I call accountability partners, where we can give and receive feedback to each other as a commitment to holding us to our divinity. And so if I need to do the work that I can to develop an alliance with whomever I'm actually in conflict with, as well as those I'm already in alliance with, to be able to say, how do we hold ourselves accountable? And it's not, people aren't always going to use the word divinity, but for me, it's wholeness or our best selves or any of that. But if I can't see, or I'm unwilling to see the divinity in another, then that's my work, not theirs, right? And that, and just another story. So that's a story that the Dalai Lama talked about. One of his colleagues, I don't think they call each other colleagues, but one of his colleagues was talking about how he was in a Chinese prison for the longest time and how he was really afraid. And the Dalai Lama said, yeah, I bet I was afraid to be able to not knowing when you're going to eat or when you're going to be beat. And his colleague said, no, I was afraid that I might lose compassion for my captors. Now, how deep is that shit, right? So if that person can kind of lean towards that, that's something toward which I can kind of strive. And all of that to say, we got to be gentle with ourselves, right? We're not going to be able to be all that all the time. There are certain practices in conflict to be able to say, sometimes I just need to understand where you're coming from, knowing that I don't have to agree with it. So that's often what being able to be in conflict with each other is, to allow for the diversity of perspectives and quote unquote truths without having to agree with it. So how do I just know that, you're more Haagen-Dazs than Ben and Jerry's, right? How do I just accept that? It doesn't have to be the same truth, right? People are not always loyal and loving. And that's the truth. And so, because if that's how people are, we can hope for people to change, but sometimes this work isn't about interacting and engaging with each other out of hope. It's actually engaging with each other out of reality. So one, hurt people. And so for me, it's how do I get into a relationship with others, knowing that the commitment to our relationship is actually a commitment to healing. So oftentimes, I'm often interacting with folks who are talking about trauma-informed practice. That for me is awesome as a start, and it's insufficient. So it's not enough to be able to say, yes, we've been traumatized by poverty, racism, classism, or maybe that's the same thing as poverty, all these oppressions, right? But if we're not addressing these issues and actually centering healing, then it's insufficient. So we also need to understand that liberation includes healing from the wounds. And social change means we have to acknowledge that we're a part of, not apart from, the woundedness of our world. Adam Kahane said that. So how do we actually get that as a part of the process? Yeah, and I would say, now I kind of know what I wanted to say. I put in my calendar if anybody wants to chat with me, because I know we're kind of running on time, and I'm always happy to chat. I think folks have chatted with me before after some of these talks. So I'm happy to do that. You can set it for 15, 30, an hour, whatever. Or you can just email. So I put in there also the the PowerPoint. So there's also my email address if you want to contact me. I think also the phone. But yes, I think the idea of the paradoxical about self-care and collective care is a trippy thing. So here's the way I've been kind of working on it. And again, not that this is right or wrong, it's just how I've been working on it. I actually see my working out and getting healthy as my contribution to the whole, right? And sometimes I used to think it's my contribution to me getting in a relationship or whatever, or just getting attention and being able to do these things. But I get that, folks need me as much as I need them. And I think folks could benefit from me being as healthy as I can be, and just as I can benefit from them. So when I do something that seems about self-care, I understand it as actually contributing to collective care, to collectivizing our care. So this is where I can be another helpful link in our chain of community. And maybe again, it's just mind stuff to myself. I don't know, but at least helps me get through the day. Part of the challenge, right, is to think that our exhaustion is a status symbol. Right? So the idea that we can keep working harder and harder just to kind of please other people, and I'm a people pleaser. You know, I started tonight in my mind and heart thinking, I hope you like me. At the same time, part of the work is being able to know it's not about the outcome. It's about the effort, right? It's about, so when we think about the Noble Eightfold Path and even the 12 steps, it doesn't talk about we are now going to be totally recovered from alcoholism, or that we're going to be totally awakened or enlightened. The path and the steps are actually the same for those who are enlightened and those who are on the journey towards enlightenment. They're the same. And what that means to me is that it's about focusing on the effort. How do I focus on what is the most loving, powerful, and elegant next step that I can take, or next action that I can take? And not be caught up in the worldly winds of pleasure or pain, or fame and ill repute, or bad reputation, right? Gain or loss, or any of these other things. It's not about the outcome. It's about what is the most loving, powerful, and elegant next action that I can take. And then do it again. And learn from it, right? So sometimes the learning is, dang, I was kind of pretty hard on myself, right? How can I practice a little loving kindness? How can I practice a little bit of compassion? How can I practice some self-forgiveness? How can I be calm in the midst of all my addictions and all my aggressions and even all my delusions, right? How can I have some grace in those moments and bow to them, trusting that it's impermanent? They will move on just like my joy might move on, right? May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvest. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments, whatever diseases there are in the world. May they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space endures, for as long as living beings remain, until then may we too abide to dispel the mystery of the world. Notice your in-breath. Just know that you're breathing in, and allow your breath to go out. And as the sounds arise, just allow it as well, as you focus on your breath, to have the sounds flow around you. wanders, just greet the wandering and then return to your concentration to your breath. focus on your breath. Prepare yourself for coming back to our space together. As you breathe in, know you're breathing in. As you breathe out, know you're breathing out. As we breathe in, know we're breathing in. And as we breathe out, know we're breathing out. May we tonight seek refuge in the Buddha, seek refuge in the Dharma, seek refuge in the Sangha.